waiting 1 or 2 minutes before starting, when people are still arriving for this first session of the Logic and Religion webinar of this year, 2026, 2026. Happy New Year to everybody. And this year, we intend to organize the fifth edition of the World Congress on Logic and Religion in Vancouver, Canada, in the second part of the year, probably by mid-October. I will talk more about that at the end of the session. So today we have Dan Dombrowski, who is from the University of Seattle, not so far from Vancouver, and we will be one of the keynote speaker of our event in Vancouver. Still wait 1 minute before starting. So I will put on the chat some parts of the handout prepared by Dan. So the title of this talk today is I put on the chat the logic of perfection, a process point of view, and with different points. Before that, let me say a few words about the speaker today. So he has been working, Professor Dombrowski has been working in different aspects of philosophy, but especially in philosophy of religion. This is why he is here today. And he is one of the specialists of the best specialists of Charles Hartshorne, who was also a specialist about philosophy of religion. I don't know if Charles Hartshorne is so famous outside of United States. Maybe Dan, you can say a few words about Charles Hartshorne.
Well, he was born in 1897 and died in 2000. So he lived in 3 centuries. And there are not many human beings who can say that. So,
and as far as I understand, his work in theology was connected with the work of Whitehead about the philosophy of process.
That's right. Yeah, he's a independent thinker. He was not a student of Whitehead's, but he's very often associated with Whitehead. Yes, very, very closely allied. Although Hartshorne is a philosopher. He taught much of his career at University of Chicago and had a big influence on theologians, but he himself was a philosopher.
So he has developed something which is called process theology.
That's right. Yeah, process theology, or neoclassical theism, is the sort of technical term for the view he defends. And he had no specific denomination. His father was an Episcopal minister, although he was like a freestanding theist and did not pledge allegiance to any particular religious denomination. So he's interested in metaphysical traditions and religious traditions around the world.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think you can start your talk. You can speak about 30, 40 minutes, and then we will have a question and a discussion. So please, I will put, when you are talking, I will put more part of your handout on the chat. But we already have, for people who are just arriving, I already put some part of the handout in the chat. I will put again. Okay, please. So you can start.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Johnny, for the invitation. It's great to meet so many people from around the world here. Zoom technology continues to amaze me that we can all get together from 24 different time zones around the world to talk about important topics in religion. So the topic of my talk is the logic of perfection, a process point of view. So this will be an exercise in perfect being philosophy of religion, on the assumption that one of the key things that needs to be done in philosophy of religion and in metaphysics is to get clear on what a perfect being would be like. And that will drive many responses to many other issues once you get clear on what a perfect being would be. But what does it mean to be perfect? It's not immediately clear what it would mean to be a perfect being. And I'd like to focus on a debate between a classical theistic version of divine perfection on the one hand, and then a neoclassical or process theistic version of divine perfection on the other. So on the classical theistic version, which is, I take it, the dominant view among philosophers and theologians in all three of the major Abrahamic religions, the classical theistic version suggests that God is perfect. Therefore, God is unchangeable. This has its roots in certain passages in Plato and Aristotle, and is, pretty much dominated the concept of God in the Abrahamic religions. On the neoclassical or process theistic version, however, there's a sense of dynamic perfection, that there are such things as perfect changes. So basically, that's what my talk for about 30, 40 minutes is going to be about the distinction between these rival versions of divine perfection. So I'm going to mention every once in a while the existence of God, but this presentation does not deal much with the existence of God. I'm more interested in the concept of God, trying to get clear on what it would mean to be a perfect being. So I take it the two major contrasts that can be drawn between classical theism on the one hand and then neoclassical or process theism on the other are, first, the difference between a certain dichotomy in classical theism that becomes a trichotomy in neoclassical theism, which I'll get to momentarily. And then, most importantly, a distinction between a monopolar view of divine perfection in classical theism as opposed to a dipolar view of perfection in neoclassical theism. So imagine, you might be able to see this in the diagram in the chat room, but imagine in your mind's eye two columns of attributes that are in contrast to each other. So on the left side, you will have being, permanence, necessity, independence, absoluteness, and abstractness. And then on the right side are the contrasting terms: becoming, change, contingency, dependence, relativity, and concreteness. Now, classical theism is famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, by accepting and defending one pole in these polar contrasts. So the classical theistic view that you find, say, in Philo in Judaism, Augustine and Aquinas in Christianity, along with Luther and Calvin as well, and Kant, and then various Muslim thinkers like Avicenna and Averroes. There's a common agreement here that God is what? Being, but not becoming. God is strictly permanent, but not changing. God is necessary, but not contingent, and so on. So you can see why this is called a monopolar version of theism, because all of the terms on the right-hand column are rejected. The assumption here is what? That, and this comes from Plato, that if a being were perfect, it would not change because it's already perfect. In other words, not a perfect being not only does not change, but it could not change, because that would seem to indicate that in the previous moment it was not perfect. Now, The neoclassical or process view suggests that this classical theistic version of divine perfection is half correct. So in a way, it is an incredible achievement to get 50% of the story correct by the 13th century. But there are other things that need to be said. Just take the contrast between permanence and change, for example. An analysis of the notion of permanence would indicate that there are both good and bad features of permanence. For example, in our dealings with each other, there's a positive sense of permanence found in people who are steadfast, dependable, reliable. There are all kinds of words in everyday English, and I assume other languages as well, that indicate the positive features of permanence. But it should also be noticed that there are types of permanence that are invidious or problematic, like pig-headedness, mulish stubbornness, refusal to adapt, and so on. Likewise, there are some negative features associated with change, a sort of flibberty-gibbet quality or fickleness, which is problematic, but also there are commendable features of change, like adaptability, responsiveness to the sufferings of others, and so on. So the task for the neoclassical theist, when thinking through the logic of perfection, is to attribute to a perfect being all of the features that are most admirable, features associated with permanence, as well as features associated with change, being as well as becoming, necessity as well as contingency, independence as well as dependence, absoluteness as well as relativity, abstractness as well as concreteness, and the list could go on. I could also mention infinite as well as finite. Now, of course, this could create a problem because now you have to worry that you would contradict yourself if you said that God is both permanent and changing. So the dipolar analysis is an attempt to show that there's not any contradiction, no logical contradiction has to be involved. So I'd like to introduce at this point a distinction between the classical theistic dichotomy between essence and existence, which is expanded by Charles Hartshorne. In many ways, this is his greatest discovery, a trichotomy of essence, existence, and actuality. And I'll link this up with the dipolar nature of process perfection. So by the essence of God, I'm referring to what God is. I'm not using the term in any strange way here. And we could, in a preliminary way, say that the essence of God is to be the greatest conceivable. So there's a debt to Anselm here, obviously. And it's a nice preliminary way to define the term God when we use it. I like this preliminary definition of God, or the divine essence, as the greatest conceivable, because presumably even religious skeptics could accept this definition. Religious skeptics are, denying or question the existence of God, and when they defend their religious skepticism, they're assuming that what the term God refers to is the greatest conceivable. So essence refers to what God is, the greatest conceivable. The term existence refers to that God is. And then actuality refers to how God exists from moment to moment to moment. So in classical theism, there's no distinction made between existence and actuality. Whereas Hartshorne wants to say, if you assert that something exists, that's quite different from how that being exists from moment to moment to moment. And that's what he means by actuality, a mode of existence from moment to moment to moment. Now, regarding the divine existence, the neoclassical or process theist agrees with the classical theist that God's existence is permanent and necessary. Okay. There's great intellectual progress that was made by the great classical theists in trying to establish that belief. However, regarding divine actuality, there's a difference of opinion. What the neoclassical or process theist wants to say is that in order to be a perfect being, God would not only is it possible for God to change, but God would have to change, especially in response to creaturely suffering. In other words, not being able to change would be a limitation in a temporal world where things are constantly changing. So, regarding divine actuality, being is rejected and becoming is defended by the neoclassical theist. Permanence is rejected and change is accepted. Necessity is rejected and contingency is accepted. Independence is rejected and dependence is accepted. And now I'm on the second page of that diagram. Absoluteness is rejected, relativity is accepted, abstractness is rejected, and concreteness is accepted. The upshot of all of this is that the neoclassical or process theists like Hartshorne and myself and other process thinkers, and there are a lot of them, you may know the names of a lot of the process philosophers and theologians who would defend this view. And a couple of them in the audience I see here today, like Tom Ord. The conclusion is what? That God always changes. God always changes. And there's no logical contradiction involved because the word always refers to the divine existence. It's the abstract claim that a perfect being exists. And the word changes refers to divine actuality. In other words, how God exists from moment to moment to moment. So there's no contradiction because these apparently these terms intention, always and change, apply to different aspects of the divine nature. And that's how the contradiction is avoided. Now, I'd like to move quickly to a defective classical theistic argument, at least defective as I see things. We'll see what you think about this, in the question and answer period. This is all contested territory, isn't it? All the stuff that we're dealing with here today. A defective argument to indicate why the neoclassical or process theist wants to replace monopolar theism with dipolar theism. So look at the following argument, which I assume is the sort of argument that classical theists have to make. In the first premise, X loves Y. In the second premise, Y, who previously did not suffer, now starts to suffer. And then in the third step, in the face of Y's suffering, X remains unchanged. I'm trying to point out how odd classical theism is when it tries to reconcile its version of divine perfection with the claim that God loves the creatures. In other words, it seems that the classical theist is saying that God loves creatures, even though God is a strictly permanent, unchanged being, an unmoved mover, is not at all internally affected by the suffering that occurs to creatures. Now, I'd like to make it clear that I'm not calling into question the Thomistic doctrine of analogy. In other words, I think Thomas made great strides in dealing with the problem of religious language in mediating between univocal language used to describe God, which seems to diminish divine perfection, and then equivocal language, which ends up with all kinds of problems. So I'm not calling into question the notion of analogical discourse regarding God, but I'm suggesting that the classical theist did an insufficient job of thinking through analogical language regarding God. In other words, the sort of love which remains completely unmoved by the suffering of creatures is not even remotely analogous to any love that I'm familiar with. So I'm trying to suggest that we can continue using analogical discourse the way classical theists do regarding God, but try to do a better job of thinking through what such analogical discourse would mean when you're considering the issue of divine love. So it strikes me that it's important to articulate how it could be that you could have divine responses to creatures, um, uh, uh, as opposed to what would occur in classical theism. I'm using a term here from Richard Creel from a generation or two ago. In classical theism, you could never really have divine responses to creatures because God is outside of time altogether. You have divine indesponses, to coin a word. In other words, I'm trying to point out how odd classical theism is when the reports of religious experiences are taken into consideration. So it's a common criticism of mystics in the Abrahamic religions, and perhaps other religions as well, that the experiences they have are at odds with, in scare quotes, the God of the philosophers. So Pascal and many other thinkers, point out how the God of religious experience seems to be quite different from, in scare quotes, the God of the philosophers. Well, I'm trying to say it's not so much the God of the philosophers that's the problem, but it's the God of a particular class of philosophers, that's to say classical theists, who've had the upper hand for many centuries now. So I'm trying to develop a conception of divine receptivity, divine change, the idea that there could be such a thing as perfect changes, and incorporating that into an account of divine perfection. I notice that I change from moment to moment, but first of all, the series of changes in my life is finite. I was born in 1953, and I don't think I'll live in 3 centuries the way Hartshorne did, being born in 53. But the series of experiences that constitute my life will eventually come to an end. Whereas a perfect being would change forever, would keep going. Not only would a perfect being change, but would change forever and not stop changing. And also, my changes and my responses to the sufferings of other creatures is always mixed in with a certain degree of egoism on my part, and a memory that is selective and so on. Whereas presumably a perfect being would be a being who sympathizes with others, undeflected by egoistic problems, and would be supremely changing in response to creaturely suffering. As you can guess, there's a difference here between the classical theistic view of God and of metaphysics in terms of, on the classical theistic view, metaphysical realities transcending time altogether in a sort of Boethian eternity, a totum simul outside of time and history. Whereas on the neoclassical or process view of God and metaphysics, metaphysical, that is to say, transcendental realities, are those that are sempiternal or everlasting. In other words, they exist at all times. So in a way, a linguistic distinction might be helpful in terms of classical theistic eternity, divine eternity, whereas process thinkers are more likely to use the term everlasting rather than eternal to avoid the assumption that God is outside of time and history altogether. This creates all kinds of, I think it solves certain problems regarding God's knowledge of the world, not just God's response to creaturely suffering, but also God's knowledge to the world. In other words, Aristotle made sense when he suggested that a strictly necessary God could not know the creatures that are changing, because if God did, then God would have to change as well. So in a way, I think Aristotle is more consistent than classical theists in that regard, who want to claim that God is strictly eternal on the one hand, and yet somehow or another knows contingent truths on the other. There's been a lot of literature, a lot of ink spilled on these problems from a classical theistic point of view, which it seems to me that you can much more parsimoniously solve a lot of the problems involved in classical theism by developing a dipolar view rather than a monopolar view. So let me talk about the 3 different views of time here to give you a feel for where the classical theist and the neoclassical theist differ. In a way, the classical theistic view rests on a notion of pure internal relations between one's existence in the present and its relationship to the past. So oneself in the present is internally related to what's happened in the past. But also in a classical theistic view, um, there's an internal relationship between one's existence in the present and what will happen in the future. And this is due to a really aggressive version of divine omniscience, because in the classical theistic view, a God who is outside of time and history knows what are, from our point of view, future contingencies, knows them as already resolved and as determinate. So if God knows with absolute assurance and in minute detail what will happen in my future, then in a way, it's already in the cards what's going to happen to me in the future, because God already knows with absolute assurance and in minute detail what will happen. This is why classical theism tends toward determinism. Now, some classical theists admit this, the later St. Augustine and Calvin and some Muslim thinkers and so on. But it seems to me that even Aquinas and other classical theists should be determinists, given the view of divine omniscience that they have. Now, in order to avoid the problems associated with pure internal relations going both ways in classical theism, you do not have to go to the other Humean extreme and defend a view of pure external relations that you find in Hume, certain stages in the life of Bertrand Russell, in some Buddhist thinkers, where one is externally related to the future, but then also one is externally related to the past. There's no causal relations between past and present. Rather, the neoclassical or process view is asymmetrical. So the claim here is that one's existence in the present is internally related to the past. So what has happened in the past causally affects what one is in the present. Okay. So the fact that I was born in Philadelphia is part of who I am now in the present. However, we are externally related to the future, because the future is not here yet to be known. The future is not here yet to exert an influence on us. So we face at least a partially open future on the process view. So one's relationship in the present to the past is somewhat, I'm tempted to say radically different from one's relationship in the present to the future. And that would be true for a divine being as well. So the greatest conceivable being would be a being who can assimilate and remember and preserve, to the extent that it is possible, everything that has happened in the past, and then would know, to the best extent possible, possibilities or probabilities regarding the future. Now, of course, the classical theist is going to criticize the process theist by saying that this is really an inadequate God. If God does not know what's going to happen in the future, this is not the greatest conceivable being. I assume all of you can understand that classical theistic criticism of process theism. Now, the response that could be made is that what it would mean to be a perfect knower would be to know everything that is logically possible. So actually, even classical theists like Thomas Aquinas would admit that much. A perfect knower would know everything that is logically possible to but Hartshorne and myself and others want to say that it's not logically possible to know in detail what's going to happen in the future. If you could, it would not be future. What a perfect knower would know regarding the future are the possibilities and probabilities regarding the future, but not the details of what will happen in the future, due to the fact that at each moment a partially new reality comes into existence, and there are indeterminacies, decisions that are made that make the future in principle unknowable in detail. So the neoclassical view of divine omniscience and view of time is at least compatible with human freedom in a way that I don't think is the case in classical theism. Actually, a lot of classical theists themselves will admit that point. That the fact that determinism is always an enticing option for classical theists is instructive. Also, and very controversially, neoclassical theists have problems with divine omnipotence as construed by classical theists. So instead, process theists tend to talk about ideal power rather than God having all power. And here, the tension between classical theism and neoclassical theism is especially intense. Very, very briefly, in the limited time I have here, there are at least three problems with belief in divine omnipotence as defended by classical theists. By the way, Hartshorne has a book titled Omnipotence and Other Theological Mistakes. Let you know where he stands on that. But there are at least three problems. One is the notorious theodicy problem, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the connection between a belief in divine omnipotence and the theodicy problem. Process thinkers tend to agree with Hume and other religious skeptics that as long as you maintain a belief in divine omnipotence, you end up with the nastiest version of the theodicy problem, and it's hard to imagine how you'll ever solve it as long as you believe that God has all power. Because it seems that any terrible thing that happens, and you're familiar with all the examples, like an infant with an intensely painful disease, are either sent by God or permitted by God. And Dostoevsky makes a lot of sense, right? And his concerns about the theodicy problem once you give in to belief in divine omnipotence, because that's one problem. Secondly, there are problems with creation ex nihilo. Now, I do not know Hebrew, but from scholars that I've read, apparently the creation found in Genesis is not ex nihilo, but a creation of order out of disorderly, aqueous stuff that had been around there, forever. Because in Whitehead and Hartshorne and other process thinkers, there's a claim that absolute nothingness is a contradiction in terms, because if you say that absolute nothingness exists, you've contradicted yourself. Okay. And thirdly, all three of these problems, require a lot of attention, I know. Thirdly, and most importantly, a belief in divine omnipotence is at odds with the Platonic view, or at least the view of Plato, at least in one of his dialogues, that is adopted by process thinkers like Whitehead and Hartshorne and myself, that being is power. So in the Sophist, there's a definition of being as power, or dynamis, so that each, let me speak in process terms here, each actual occasion, each experience has both the power to receive influence from others and then also to exert influence on others in however slight a way. So this notion of being as power to receive influence from others and to exert influence on others goes all the way down in a process version of panpsychism, even to the level of cells and perhaps subatomic particles. So if being is power, both the power to receive influence from others as well as the power to exert influence on others, then no being, not even a divine being, could have all power. Because if there were an omnipotent being, in the sense of a being that had all power, then no other beings could exist with powers of their own. But beings other than God do exist with powers of their own, both passive powers and active powers. In other words, the concept of omnipotence is metaphysically impossible from a process point of view. Bergson is also very, very good on this particular issue. So for these three reasons, the nastiest version of the theodicy problem, the difficulties with creation ex nihilo, and the process commitment to the view of being as dynamic power. It's very interesting that the Greek word for power is the etymological root for our word in English, dynamic, which is fortuitous from a process point of view. For all these reasons, there's a criticism of the belief in divine omnipotence, and instead a conception of ideal power. Now, it's power that is persuasive rather than coercive, where the divine being offers a lure forward to a better world by offering a model of divine perfection and beauty, moral qualities as well as aesthetic qualities that are ideal. Um, um, in a way, this is a return to the Platonic view in the Timaeus of reason persuading necessity. In other words, that there are factors in the world that are partially outside the control of even a divine being, which makes what? Life tragic. So there's a resistance on the part of neoclassical or process theists, a resistance to any sort of triumphalism, in religious belief, where, it's assumed that eventually everything will make sense and eventually all good will conquer all evil. Process thinkers have a tendency to think that life is tragic the way the ancient Greeks did. As long as they're beings with memory, that will never change. There will be no triumphal, eventual victory of good over evil, even for a theistic believer in the neoclassical mold. Because as long as as long as something terrible has happened, as long as there are beings with memory who remember that terrible thing that happened, tragedy will not be completely overcome. So in another context, I'd like to argue that life is tragicomic. There are tragic elements in life, and also as Shakespeare realized, comedic things as well. And life is a peculiar mixture of tragedy and comedy. So one of the objections to theism, really familiar objections to theism that you get from religious skeptics, is this triumphalism and sort of wistful belief that eventually everything will make sense in the end due to divine perfection. Neoclassical theists are skeptical of that particular version of theism. So there'd be all kinds of examples of classical theists I could talk about if we had time, and also examples of classical or process theists in all three of the Abrahamic religions, and also in some of the other great wisdom traditions around the world, including Hinduism and Buddhism, there are many Hindu and Buddhist thinkers who are also process thinkers. In a way, and let me just wrap up in one or two sentences here. Everything I've said here is an exercise in liberal religion, in the sense that what I'm trying to do is offer a third way between orthodoxy on the one hand and then religious skepticism on the other. So I see myself as fitting into that tradition of trying to develop a third way between orthodoxy and religious skepticism. And most notably, I've been relying on Hartshorne here, but there are many other thinkers in this tradition of liberal religion that I would speak very highly of. Let me stop there. I've got real thick skin. If you have questions, comments, criticisms, that's what philosophy is all about. So,
thank you very much. And now it's open to question and discussion. I put, if you can have a look, if everybody can have a look, I put on the chat handout. Now. Okay, so now we have a first question by Evan, please. You have to.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, we can hear you. Thanks.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Okay. Let me start by saying I got sort of mixed up in scheduling, and I may have to very impolitely leave in the middle of your answer. So
Okay. We'll muddle through without you.
I apologize in advance if that happens. I hope it doesn't.
Mhm.
Okay. So, boy, there's a lot of questions here. Let me ask this one. Early on, you were talking about divine response to love as having to involve some sort of change. in God because there's change in what he loves. And that seems to be true, although abstractly speaking, you could say God is steady in his love, right? Now, this has, it seems to me, rather profound implications. Um, eh, why isn't the view that you hold one that strips God of all possibility of action? Sometimes he performs miracles, sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he hardens Pharaoh's heart, and sometimes he doesn't. Um, all of those things, in one sense, are change. That is, there is some sort of causal power emanating from God that influences the world, even if the reverse isn't true. What's your response to that?
Hey, yeah, thanks. That's a good question. First of all, that phrase that you used, a perfect being would be steady in love. I agree with that. That makes sense to me. It's like the phrase that I mentioned earlier, God always changes. So the permanence or the steadiness um, aspect of divine perfection refers to an existence that is perfect, okay, that does not waver. But the particular instances of love, the particular ways in which a perfect being would respond to this creature rather than that one in their idiosyncrasies. Think of the biblical line about, God caring even for the fall of a sparrow, right? That would seem to require a sort of love that entails change. So that phrase that you used, God's love would be steady, I think makes perfect sense to me. Okay. At one
But
point,
that,
you mentioned miracles, that sometimes God acts by way of miracles. Hartshorne and myself don't want to rule out the possibility of miracles, but Hartshorne and me, I hardly ever talk about them. I don't have much to say at all. Okay.
I think what
Because
you're doing is ruling out divine action altogether.
yeah, there's still a sense in which God would certainly act as a final cause or a lure forward, but then also God is an efficient cause. Um, if what you mean by God is an efficient cause is not controlling absolutely the outcome events, but rather persuading events
But
toward a good result. So,
but then but then but then there are some times when God acts in whatever way he does, and sometimes he doesn't, and any classical theist will insist on that. So I
right.
don't see a problem for classical theism.
Mm, okay. Mhm. Not even with respect to omnipotence and the theodicy problem.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now we go to the next question. Thomas, please.
Yeah, my question's in the chat, but I'll read it for you, Dan. Uh,
Thanks.
Classical theists typically describe divine love as benevolence without any responsiveness on God's part, which can sound very altruistic. God's giving, 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 giving. But they then typically say God genuinely loves or desires God's self as the only object that would be worthy of God's desire. And that sounds really egoistic. Hartshorne combines the two and says God is altruistic in one sense and egoistic in another. And it's kind of a softball question for you, but I'd like for you to talk some about that.
Well, I agree with everything you said there, Tom. So, uh, um, uh, that I understand why you might want to slice the distinction thin there, where divine goodness could be seen as benevolence, right, and not responsiveness. Now, there is a distinction there, isn't there, between benevolence and responsiveness, because responsiveness seems to indicate some sort of essential connection with temporality, right? That it's not if you do believe in a partially open future, then it's not in the cards what's going to happen in the future, and that if there are unexpected sufferings that occur, a perfect being would be a being that not merely has a benevolent disposition, but would respond, to creaturely suffering. So I think that's a helpful distinction to make. And it seems it's very hard for classical theists to articulate a notion of divine responsiveness to suffering. But somehow or other, now this is the sort of thing that classical theists understand perfectly, and it's a real head scratcher for me. From a classical theistic point of view, God eternally, and in a Boethian totem symbol, has already responded to the sufferings that my kids and grandkids are going to experience, or future environmental disasters brought about by climate change. The response, in scare quotes, is already there and has been from eternity. I just don't understand that. In other words, one of the things that you find in Hartshorne is, and he had this belief from a very young age, is a sense of at-homeness with the world described by Lyell and Darwin, and the idea that we live in a temporal world, and that you have slight changes that occur over immense lengths of time. That whatever it would mean to be a religious believer has to come to terms with this pervasive influence of temporality on the lives in which we live. I hope I'm responding somewhat to what you're saying there, Tom.
Yeah, thank you.
Some more questions?
I would like to ask a question.
Yeah, please.
Do you deal in any way with the thought of Charles Sanders Peirce and his neglected argument for the reality of God? Would that be another whole category of thought about this?
Yes, very much so. I don't want to say anything much about that particular article of Peirce's because it deals with the existence of God, and maybe in some other context, talk more about the existence of God. But Peirce was, practically unknown except for a few, fans of his until Hartshorne and Paul Weiss edited the Peirce papers. So they were just in boxes at Harvard University, and Hartshorne was the one, along with Paul Weiss, who edited those and made those available to the general public. So there's a lot in Peirce that heavily influences Hartshorne. One thing that Hartshorne does is, Peirce has these famous categories of firstness, secondness, and thirdness that Hartshorne temporalizes. And I've always found very, very instructive how Hartshorne interprets Peirce, although I've heard from Peirce scholars that it's not exactly fair to Peirce. So when you read Hartshorne talking about Peirce, you're probably getting as much or more Hartshorne that you are Peirce. But that neglected argument for the existence of God in Peirce, I find very, very powerful. Yes. And also Peirce believed in a partially open future, right? He was an opponent to determinism at a time when many or most scientists, were still committed to determinism. So a lot of the things I talked about here show Peircean influences.
I would just add, if I may, a correction. Peirce doesn't talk about the existence of God because he's not arguing for that. He won't argue that God exists, but that for the reality of God, which is something different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Do you deal with Heidegger at all? Would that be another approach to this?
Could be. Hartshorne, after he got his doctorate at Harvard around 1923 or so, he went to study with both Husserl and Heidegger and attended lectures of both Husserl and Heidegger. And actually, Hartshorne wrote the first review of Being and Time in English.
Wow.
Yeah. He liked Heidegger, very briefly, he liked Heidegger more than Husserl, but preferred the American pragmatist version of phenomenology better because he thought it was closer to experience. The problem that he had with Husserl is that Husserl's appeal to experience was heavily intellectualized as he saw things, whereas Heidegger's version of experience took much more into account care, memory, all kinds of affective phenomena that he did not find in Husserl. But he thought that William James and Peirce and people like that did a better job of phenomenology still. So there's a long story there, but there's partial overlap with Heidegger. So I know a lot of people want to interpret Heidegger as a process philosopher as well, but obviously there are all kinds of terminological issues and things that have to be sorted out. But there's reason for a lot of material for dialogue. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much. So we're reaching the end of this session. I would like to remember you that we will organize the next World Congress of Logic and Religion in Vancouver next October this year. And Dan Dombrowski will be keynote speaker of this event. So you are welcome to join us and to have a live discussion with him, because our event will be 100% live in-person event. So everybody is welcome. I put here on the chat the website of Logic and Religion with a list of events. We don't have yet precise information about this meeting in Vancouver, because we are still discussing the exact schedule. We had to change the schedule because first we wanted to organize the event in July, but then there is a World Cup which will take place in Vancouver. It will be a bit complicated to have this event at this time. And I think October anyway is nice because there will be all the students will be there, and we like the participation of students. And in Vancouver, there are a lot of universities, and there will be a lot of students. I take the opportunity also to announce another event I am organizing in Rio de Janeiro in July. I will put on the site because I see that one of speaker will be there. Keynote speaker will be there. So it's an event about the famous question of Socrates and Plato. What is it? So in this event in Rio de Janeiro, we already have the website with the call for paper and so on, the list of keynote speakers. So we will have, I see that the speaker Tom Adagent will be there. He's here. He will give a talk about what is art. And we will have a talk. We will have talks about any kind of topic, like what is nothing and what is beauty, what is truth, what is freedom. All topics are welcome. And at the same time, we will have some talks about the question itself, the famous theistic question. We'll have one of the best specialists of this question in Plato, with Vasilis Politis, a Greek philosopher who is now working in Ireland, and also some people like Sylvain Delcominet, also a great specialist of Greek philosophy and Plato. So everybody is welcome to join. Now, the call for paper is already on. You can submit something, an abstract, until the end of February or end of March. We'll check the details. Now, coming back to this Logic and Religion project, we will have the next webinar. I will put here the link of the webinars. Will be next month. We have some webinar next month about African and Afro-Brazilian religion, and so on. You can have a look. So, thank you again for the participation of all. Francisco, you want to say something, please?
No, you already announced the next webinar. Thanks so much, Genevieve, for sharing the session today. Just let you know that these webinars, we are having those roundtables actually part of Ricardo's project, Templeton Project, founded by Templeton Foundation. So he has these 4 roundtables that have been taking place in a webinar format. And we were happy to have that integrated with our Logic and Religion webinar. And because of the constraints of the project, 2 of these webinars were entirely in Portuguese, but the next 2 roundtables are going to be entirely in English. So if you wanted to participate last 2 times and you couldn't because of language constraints, now you can, because it will be entirely in English. So thank you so much, and see you guys in 30 days.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thanks again, Professor Dombrowski.
Thanks, Francisco.
Thank you very much all the way.
Thank you very much.